There's a lot of good work going on in the academic world, and a lot of it has substantial connections to policy, but the connection often doesn't get made in public. I think the public debate is dominated by advocates. It's dominated by people who have strong financial interests. A lot of them have really smart, good things to say, but there's an important role for people who take a bit more of a step back, who simply call things as they see them, and that is generally drowned out in public discussions of climate change, where everyone is trying to win a near-term legislative fight. The Obama administration's approach to domestic climate policy is fundamentally different from the Bush administration's approach. It remains to be seen whether they can put all the pieces of the domestic strategy into place through legislation. I think their international approaches are actually quite similar. They both focus fundamentally on bottom-up schemes. They both see a significant role for the UN process, but not an exclusive role. The difference is that if you want to focus on bottom-up efforts at the international level, that makes no sense unless it's backed up by very strong domestic commitments. So the Obama administration has a more coherent approach to domestic and international policy, and if it can put its domestic pieces in place, then its international approach can potentially work out. That doesn't necessarily add up to all that much for COP16 in Cancun, though. The odds are heavily against a U.S. climate bill being in place by then. I think everyone understands that. The question is, what should we try to accomplish? At Cancun, there are really two schools of thought. One that says we should pick off a few important but discrete and doable initiatives and try to move them forward. And another that essentially says let's get halfway to a big bang that would happen next year. Anything that helps build understanding and support for action in the United States is positive. But this bill is a mixed bag. It provides potentially less money for international efforts, and that will provide clarity that will shape the discussions. It also provides or creates a bit of suspended animation. Everyone is still betting against the bill, but it's difficult for U.S. negotiators to engage on the basis of there not being a bill while something is still being debated on Capitol Hill. Well, I don't think we necessarily have to pick one over the other. There are a variety of forums, each with important contributions to make, and frankly, each with contributions that we don't quite understand yet. The challenge is how to make these pieces work together so that instead of countries running into whatever forum allows them to escape responsibility the most, they participate in forums that encourage action. And we don't really understand yet whether we can create a dynamic where the UN process plays a big role and these other processes also play a big role in a way that creates constructive feedback rather than a race to the bottom. I don't think you can privilege any one of those topics in international climate negotiations. There's been an unfortunate attempt to try to figure out what the one thing is that will bring everyone together. Should we all talk about the catastrophic risks from climate change, and will that bring everyone together? Should we all talk about green jobs and growth? Will that bring everyone together? The answer is that different people come to the table with different interests, and they don't all need to work on the issue for the same reasons. They just all need to work on the issue enough. So trying to pick one over the other, I think, is a dead end. You need a system that allows people to participate in ways that clearly reflect their own interests so that they can sustain their efforts politically at home. I think there's broad agreement that the state should shape the actions of private enterprise in addressing the climate change challenge, that this is too big in terms of capital, in terms of social implications for the government to microengineer it. The question is how. A few years ago, there was an added benefit in talking about market-based approaches because that somehow sounded more palatable to people. That's now become a political downside in talking about things like cap-and-trade systems. So there's going to have to be a bit of a negotiation of that. there is also going to be some distrust amongst people for the more freewheeling market-based approaches to these sorts of things, particularly, again, ones involving carbon trading, because there is a distrust of traders and a distrust of markets. So we may see, at least in the short term, a somewhat more rigid approach. The oil spill pulls in two directions. On the one hand, it makes people slightly less enthusiastic about oil, which can be tied into climate legislation, even though the major impact of climate legislation in the near future is on the electricity sector rather than on transport and oil. It also, though, has a negative tactical impact. A big part of the deal around the climate bill was supposed to be a trade of emissions reductions in exchange for expanded offshore production. The political support for expanded offshore production is just not going to be there on a broad enough basis to move forward in the near term. Certainly not before the spill has been stopped. I think at a minimum we'll have to wait until then to see what is possible politically.